Hello, Seaside Shadows, and welcome to Cemetery Saturday. My name is Courtney, and I'll be your hostess for this historic and eerie, in a historical sense, setting here. I am in Middletown, Connecticut, at what many people know as the CVH Hospital, the Connecticut Valley Hospital Cemetery. Now, back in the day when this cemetery was actually running as an active place where burials were taking place, this was known as the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane. So names have changed since then, and though it is still a mental health facility in many ways, it has always been a home for those that have in a way been ostracized by their communities. And this happened especially in the 1800s and 1900s. Now, when we think about mental health in the 1800s and early 1900s, it's hard to imagine it being treated in a medical sense with the amount of empathy that we are aware of in 2021. There is this commonality about depression, anxiety, and all sorts of things that may come over us at any point in our lives, and that it's hard for any of us to walk through lives without experiencing sometimes, whether it be something chronic or something that's temporary. We may also look at things now that come with older age, such as dementia and Alzheimer's, and know that that is the human body and the human brain all of a sudden becoming conditioned with these memory lapses as someone grows older. But none of this medical knowledge, nor perhaps ability to empathize with it, existed in the 1800s or early 1900s. In fact, talk of all of this was highly discouraged and was considered a shame upon a family. So when one had a family member that they considered to be mentally ill, they might pretend they just didn't exist. How sad is that? Didn't exist. And sometimes people wouldn't find out until there was a knock on their door years later that they had a relative who had been alive for decades here at a facility such as the Hospital for the Insane that we know today as Connecticut Valley Hospital. And then they would find out that they passed away and had never known they had been here all along. That shows that shame that lived in folks about the ideas of mental illness, which varied here at CVH. There were people with depression, were people with all sorts of manic episodes, and people who committed suicide, who are buried here in this very graveyard, who perhaps never found the peace that they were seeking. There were those that would go out into danger or find themselves in dangerous situations and died in drownings, fires, one even run over by a bull, buried here in this cemetery. And there were those who would just live out their years at the hospital and then come to be buried here. Now, CVH, as we call it here in Connecticut, was established in 1868, so just at the conclusion of the American Civil War. And there are accounts that very quickly the hospital filled up way beyond its initial capacity, which was in a large building known as Shrew Hall today. And it filled up to over 140 patients very quickly. Over the years, it would see hundreds more and thousands more. And they also started to operate almshouses and poorhouses on site, because in addition to having mental health things, the world was not so kind to people that lived in poverty or struggled to keep a job. And they would oftentimes be put into either workhouses or almshouses and poorhouses, which was akin to mental illness, so that was put here as well. Then there were separate buildings that were put here for the criminally insane. And oftentimes when someone's prison sentence was over, they would be brought to a hospital facility such as CVH, where they would spend out the remainder of their years, and not necessarily being rehabilitated, but still being known for criminal behavior. And there are stories of those who escaped and still committed criminal acts when they made it outside the walls of CVH. So the stories here are many, but so many go unnamed. Because what I want you to see here in this cemetery, what I want you to focus on, are these graves with numbers. Each person buried here was given a number because, again, it was considered almost a shame to have died with mental illness. You would not want your name to be associated with the hospital or the grounds, So it was to keep some dignity and pride to your burial, to have the number there. Of course, in many ways, that almost ostracizes and isolates them more when we look back in history and we look at the stories that have to be shared. There's a remarkable story that came from some descendants of one of the buried here. And he was a gentleman who actually worked at one time in his life for none other than P.T. Barnum. And his job was to paint all of kind of the circus wagons and things and all of the bright colors that you may be familiar with when you look back at circuses. And his name was James Burney. Now, James Burney went off to work one day, or so his family thought. He was a local from Western Connecticut, and then he never returned. And then no one was able to really figure out what happened to him after he returned. They said he went missing. Well, generations further go down the line, and they get questions about the unique spelling of their last name, Burney, B-Y-R-N-I-E. It is unique, and one of the descendants said that when she was growing up, she would comb the phone books looking for other people that spelled Burney the same way that she did. But as she combed through them, she felt even more confused. Where did the name come from? Where was this missing grandfather? So she went to all of the state archives and really started digging through records. And finally, she was able to find James Burney, who had been committed to a mental institution in Danbury, Connecticut, and then moved here to CVH, Connecticut Valley Hospital, where he passed away and came to be buried here, one of the 400 row. And they went to go find where he was buried and found that his, like many of the stones here, was completely missing. How sad, right? There are stories, like I mentioned too, of others not finding out about a burial here until the burial took place, meaning they didn't know their loved one was alive until they came to find out that they were dead. That tragedy was something that struck with descendants who experienced it, but it also struck a pastor here at a church in Middletown, at the Congregational Church, in the early 2000s. He states that in the late 1990s he was driving by and he couldn't help but be compelled and drawn to look at these nameless stones that stand here. And he felt, as someone who had mental illness in his family, that these folks deserved an identity, a blessing, a name. And so he made it his mission to find out the names of each interred burial here. When he got those records released around 1999, when it was deemed that there was no need to protect those names, as there was nothing in force when these people were buried that would keep it private, he made sure to come up with a plan. And for 14 years, on Memorial Day, he came here and read aloud the names of 100 people buried here. Their names heard aloud for the first time. And people would gather, sometimes locals who also felt compelled to know, sometimes a few descendants, though they said very few because so many didn't know. But finally, he endeavored to bring them some peace. They then decided that the peace should be taken a step further. And around the time that the announcing of the names started, they decided to put a memorial here, which we will show you momentarily, that serves as a directory for each of the names here. So you can come and attribute a name to the number that you see. And it does take your breath away. There was one quote in the New York Times and Hartford Courant that to touch the wall is almost like touching the Vietnam Wall and feeling their stories, feeling their energy, knowing how real they were. When I talk about the people that were here, it's hard to imagine what kind of insufferable conditions they were living in. Now, we're also talking about a time when women would often be committed to institutions because their husbands perhaps found them to be in a bad mood too often, or not able to carry children, or perhaps a young woman who got pregnant at a young age out of wedlock would come to an institution, give birth, The child would be committed and given to someone else, and then they would be released back to their family, not pregnant. I've read stories where people have just said she was melancholy too often and would put the woman in here for stints at a time until her mood bettered. And when you walk around here, for the few who have chosen to put names by the stones, you may find it kind of shocking how many women that you see here. Now, there would also have been patients who did suffer dementia and Alzheimer's. The man that suffered that dementia was one that I introduced you to before, named James Burney. It was in fact found that all the lead in the paint he was using for the circus wagons caused him to have some terrible troubles with his memory, and that ended up being why he got committed here. And like I mentioned, there were those who committed heinous acts of murder who would be right alongside folks with memory problems or melancholy. And perhaps most famous of all is a serial killer named Amy Archer Gilligan. And she was from Windsor, Connecticut, and was known to poison her victims with arsenic. She was brought to trial on quite a few victims, only found guilty on one, but she worked at a nursing home where there were over 60 deaths attributed with her. And then she came here and lived out the rest of her years. So how does this match? Well, of course it doesn't if you know anything about mental health, but that's how everyone was seen. If something was even slightly off, you were all put together and there was an anonymous nature. You could no longer be acknowledged by the family. That sadness, of course, can be felt here, but I do think that there's a sense of peace and the acknowledgement that has come in the recent century for those buried here. And Marty and I have actually been walking around for some time before we started recording here today. And we've been walking around because we were compelled and drawn to the trees and the graves, but also look at the dragonflies that fly through the air over the graves. They are in great number, and the closer you get to the ground, the more you can see them. And we looked up dragonflies and their spirit totem meaning new life, love, rebirth, peace, freedom, and hope. So that means that these folks, perhaps in their resting in peace here, have found a peace that they needed in life. And that makes me feel altogether calm here. Now we are in what is the newer section, believe it or not. We will bring you to the oldest section in a moment and be able to show you as it is across the street. Now, these burials took place between 1868 and 1957. So there weren't any burials by all accounts after 1957 at this site, though there still may have been deaths. Private burials would have been given to them at that time. Now we will walk you across in a moment, but I just want to give you a minute to pay your respects to the folks here that are buried alongside these numbers. As we walk across the way, I will also let you know of an account that was published in the New York Times and the Hartford Courant. And this was published in 1899 by a resident of Connecticut Valley Hospital, aka at that time the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane. This man, according to the directory up at the front, which we will also show you on our walk, is not buried here, which makes me think that he was able to get out. But this is the name of the article, which again shows you what was going on here. "I am not insane," he writes. "I have been held a prisoner here for 5½ years. Won't someone help me get out and back to my rooms at 147 State Street, Hartford, Connecticut? All the male doctors and male attendants in this hospital are inhuman. They are monsters. The people in this hall delight to abuse me, stealing my things out of my till." He signed this, Howard S. Talcott. And he wrote it in his almanac pages and made sure that it was sent out, the torn page. His acquaintances even came forward that knew him in life and said that he was not crazy. He was erroneously placed inside this home. But yet, here he lived his years, and according to him, in less than desirable conditions. So know that each of these people perhaps had their own stories, sadness, and trauma. We're going to take you to the memorial and then across the way to the first burials. You have made it to the first burials here at the CVH cemetery. The first 200 are on this side of the small dirt road, and the remaining of the 1,687, so nearly 1,500 more, are on the other side of the road. This right here, where I'm standing with you right now, is the first burial here. And they do have them going down this way and this way. And then you can tell they rope back this way for the second 100, burying them almost next to or on top of one another. It is a lot to think about when you come here, but it's an important message that is told to us by those buried here. Their lives meant something. They were someone to someone. They had loved ones, they had dreams, and they had hopes. And they never wanted to be away for the amount of time that they were. There is also the important message that stigma should be released from mental illness, as no one should die so anonymously. So with that, we wrap up today's Cemetery Saturday. And if you would like to see more from this particular cemetery, let us know in the comments. We are hoping to come back here and look a little bit more into some of the individuals who are buried here as much as we can, though we know that will take some archive research. So let us know, and if you know of any stories here that you want us to endeavor to find out or tell, please do let us know in the comments. Have a great weekend, everyone.